Welcome back for another Friday Night In with 10-Minute Horror. I think this one might actually clock in under 10 minutes, but we'll see how the wine sits. Cheers to that. I'd grab a blanket, because you're going to want to get cozy for this one. It's a two-parter. Part 2 is out Sunday, and Part 1 is out right now. This is FESTUNG 212, Part 1, A Discovery in the Mountains. I was a half hour into my third flight today. At least this one was almost over. It started 14 hours ago, flying from DC to Cape Town. There, I caught a flight to Novo Air Base in the Antarctic. We're now flying west along the Mulik-Hoffman Mountains to a small camp set up by the US military. There was a recent discovery, and as a frequent business partner, I was being called in to consult. I was briefed quickly. A flood of information compacted down. A World War II base had been discovered, hidden in a deep valley under a mountain. It had the name FESTUNG 212 carved into the rock above the entrance. FESTUNG was German for fortress. No question who the place belonged to. There was said to be a massive weapons cache, and they wanted high-level opinions on them, so I had to praise and categorize, perhaps reverse engineer certain tech if it somehow surpassed ours. Or it was a theoretical consult. They'd want theories of types of weapons the Germans could have below if they hadn't already investigated. I really didn't know. Guessing the types of weaponry the Germans would have is kind of like guessing what type of ammo a school shooter is going to use. It's limited, but varied. We basically know the limits of their tech because we faced it in battle. But that was the thing with the Nazis. They experimented. I studied Nazi warfare and the different categories of weapons they used. I'd also studied how they'd been trying to harness black magic to blend with modern technology. They weren't anchored down by morals or ethics, right or wrong, good or evil. In their eyes, they were the good, and they were destroying the evil. I'd read Hitler sent out massive exploration parties to various parts of the globe, searching for mythical artifacts, lost civilizations, advanced but abandoned or lost. Anything that could give the crowds answers or an edge in warfare. We were lucky they hadn't discovered anything, as far as we knew. I'm what you'd call a weapons engineer. I won't go into my education, but it's extensive and involves engineering and biotech. I was poached young, groomed, and built up to create psyops and mass casualty military tech. I started a private firm called String Control. We didn't advertise online. We designed ways to destabilize nations for private corps and equity firms. We used a variety of methods from social to technological to pharmaceutical to political to 2 million other tactics we had up our sleeves. Our previous contract was with a Southeast Asian country trying to invade and take over another country without using any physical force. We looked into the target country and found 3/4 of its economy was based on agriculture, so we simply needed to control the weather. This might seem like a conspiracy theory idea, but it's real science. The Saudi Arabians have been adapting it for years. It's referred to as cloud seeding and uses drones to force precipitation with electric charges. There's other ways of doing this, like adding substances through chemtrails, such as silver iodide, to existing clouds to induce rain, or even snow. But with flooding, the news of the disaster would enter the national stage, and other countries would send help. We had to avoid that, so we designed a system of drones to perform the opposite. For 2 months, the target country didn't receive a drop of rain. Their economy crumbled as no one could grow or sell or eat. The target government caved and agreed to all terms. After the target had signed on the dotted lines, our employer paid us to flash flood the country for 2 days anyways, just out of spite. It was disgusting, certainly, but I figured I'd be getting hired by another country to take this one out soon enough, and I looked forward to that day. I also had a lexicon of contacts for old World War II weapons and paraphernalia, buyers and collectors, and not the ones you'd find in the yellow pages. But this felt bigger than that. This felt secretive on a very dangerous level. I thought back to the Germans. I wondered what type of weapons they were working on, how advanced they were for their time. It wasn't just the artillery I was interested in seeing. I was hoping to take a look at some of their labs. I was fascinated with their experiments. What was he working on next, though? Genes? Gases? Viruses? What a horrible man he was. They all were. I sat back, exhausted. It wasn't just the flights or the time changes. I was burned out with work and had been planning to walk away for some time. My conscience was starting to catch up to me, something I thought I'd shrunken down to the subatomic level and buried in lead. I thought about some of the horrible things I'd been hired to do in the past. My mind was regurgitating it all more lately, like I was in confession with myself. One of my first contracts was with pharmaceutical companies, lacing dormant but aggressive strains of meningitis in vitamin shots. We were given carte blanche by the governing medical bodies because they had a meningitis treatment regimen nearing release. So we played a little God. We tested other illnesses and diseases and made some frightening discoveries. If you give a certain percentage of the population a debilitating illness, it becomes genetic. If they have kids, they get it and pass it on too. There's a reason you see a lot more today than in the past. It's not just because the population's grown. Then I moved on to pediatrics, but I won't go into that. That's what causes me the most nightmares. The snow and cold hit me in the face the second the airplane door opened and I stepped out. Even with the thick multiclava and scarf, this was a different kind of chill. My shoulders shot up, touching my ears. We were directed to a series of snowmobiles that took us to another, even smaller camp. There, we were given snowshoes and had to hike to the rocky summit of the Mulig-Hoffman Mountain a few hundred meters away. I could see a muted orange glow coming from what appeared to be a large doorway at the end of the footpath we were following. It wasn't a door, but it was an entrance, carved into the rock. It led into a tunnel lined with mining lights. We followed our guides as the path curved and winded and took us deeper under the mountain. Our guides began taking off their gloves, hats, and jackets. What were they doing? Wouldn't it be getting colder the deeper we went? I passed by several explosives charges attached to support beams throughout the tunnel. The explosives looked old and had German writing on them. Our guides informed us they were connected to other explosive charges set up at strategic points throughout the mountain to collapse it in on itself if needed. Why would that be needed? Our path curved ahead and I felt warmth on my face. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a massive open cave. What the fuck was I looking at? The cave was lit by pod lights pointed up. They sent frightening, jagged shadows up the walls to the stalactites hanging down. But I saw green, so much green. This far north, all you see is white and gray, but this resembled something closer to a botanical garden. There was luscious vegetation and a pond. The long stalactites hanging from the roof in the cave were covered in foliage. Our guide saw my shocked face and told me we were in a geothermal pocket. The mountain was lined with them, and they were rich in vitamins and minerals, so they sustained multiple types of hot springs and plant life, even without photosynthesis. But the greenery wasn't what held my attention any longer. At the far end of the overwhelming cave, a gargantuan, ancient statue of a bearded, Herculean-like hero keeping evil at bay was carved into the rock. The statue's hand was pressing what appeared to be a large creature's head into the ground. It was like a hawk, but with teeth. Or a dragon? The longer I stared at the statue, the more the word God seemed the only fitting way to describe it. In front of the statue, a small portable had been set up. That's where we were headed. Our guide told me to follow him and his steps specifically as we moved through the flora. I stopped and touched one of the plants, but hadn't seen anything like it before. It had multiple veins of varying colors running through it. There were a half dozen scientists and military personnel sprinkled throughout the cave, some with metal detectors. Oh shit, they were looking for landmines. I followed our guide's footsteps perfectly. We entered the portable. Inside, there was a large freight elevator, a mix of old German technology and our updated modern type. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan stood by it, ready to debrief us. But first, he recommended we stick to the approved paths and hallways. The Germans had left booby traps. In the first 2 days of discovery, 5 scientists and 3 soldiers had died from a variety of old tripwires and nail bombs. It had been messy, but they believed it was safe now. Great. Stick to the paths and hallways. Sullivan moved on. The elevator was, in fact, built by the Germans, but the military believed the hole it went into had been discovered by them, not made. The hole dropped 13 kilometers straight down into the earth. At the depth of 4 kilometers, there was an elevator switchover which dropped another 5 kilometers. There, an additional elevator switchover was needed for the final 4 kilometers to reach the hole's depth of 13 clicks. The elevator was the only way up or down. Though there was a second tunnel up that ran parallel to the first switch, but it looked to be dug by the Germans as a backup route. It appeared they hadn't moved on to dig any for the next 2 levels, at least from what had been found. This pathway was located just to the side of the elevator platform at the first switchover and was said to take between 4 and 5 hours to climb to the surface in a very cramped and slanted crawl space. We were given heat-repellent suits and instructed to stay inside the compounds at all times upon reaching the bottom level, which was where we were headed. How the hell was there a naturally formed hole that went this deep? Maybe the Germans really had discovered something. As we rode down, my first thought was this was being used as a massive missile silo. 13 kilometers down though, what kind of tech did they really have? Or worse, find? What if they discovered a new type of energy source, something that dwarfed enriched uranium in fission capability and output? I got chills. It reminded me of the most dangerous weapon I'd ever heard of that was, thankfully, never used. The weapon was part of Project Pluto, a nuclear R&D division of the US military, and was referred to as SLAM, S-L-A-M, as in Supersonic Low Altitude Missile. It was massive, and in order to reach ramjet speed, would need to be launched by conventional rocket boosters from the ground. After reaching cruising altitude in unpopulated areas near the target, the nuclear core would be made critical. It would then have unlimited range from its energy source and cruise in circles until it was ordered down to the deck. That meant the SLAM, which would be carrying a mass payload of nuclear weapons, would turn the cruise missile into an unmanned bomber and deliver all of its warheads to the targets in an unwavering storm. But it didn't end there. After the payload was delivered, the missile could then spend weeks flying over nearby, populated areas at low altitudes and cause massive shockwaves and deadly radiation that would destroy entire cities. If and when the missile went down, it would spew deadly radiation for hundreds of years to the surrounding areas. Someone had actually thought of using this weapon. There was no way the Germans had gotten that far, though. We changed over onto the next elevator, which was located on a platform directly below us. The hole was said to be perfectly straight, going down through earth, ice, rock, and granite. As we rode the second elevator down, I watched the walls passing and noticed there weren't digging or claw marks or anything. This really was naturally formed. We changed over to the third and final elevator. I started to think about what the hole had been used for. Sacrifice, maybe? It might be naturally formed somehow, but the statue in front of it was carved by man. It reflected us, after all. I wonder if there were more statues where we were headed. There couldn't be. It'd be too hot without suits. Unless they, whoever they were, had found a way. We arrived at the bottom of the hole, which opened up to a large cavern with multiple German-built facilities inside. There was a large weapons cache and depot, a series of laboratories and multiple bunking dormitories spread through large, open caverns in the earth. Apparently, there were stockpiles of canned food and supplies to last decades down here. I couldn't believe I was here. I wasn't aware of anyone who descended this far. Even now, 80 years later, I'd only heard of the Kola Superdeep in Russia in the 80s, reaching 12 clicks before it was shut down. Mysterious circumstances and subterranean sounds was the byline for the closure, if I recall. It hadn't been drilled or dug through rock and granite and earth, though. The Kola had been strategically placed to take advantage of permafrost below the surface. Ice was far easier to drill through than rock and granite, and it had taken them years to dig. And this was deeper. We appeared to be in another geothermal pocket, but the plants were all purples and reds and oranges here. Steam rose from fissures in the ground like hydrothermal vents at the bottom of an ocean. I stared out the tiny windows of the compound, unbelieving the life that could survive down here at this depth with this heat. I was directed to the bunk rooms where I'd be sleeping when and if I needed to. Sullivan then brought me to the weapons cache where it had already been swept for booby traps. That made the crater in the pit of my stomach a bit smaller. I was still thinking about the 8 men who died in the first 2 days. I'd been wondering if the Nazis had used some kind of trigger and gear traps. I'd love to take a look at their handiwork, but we'd start with the nuclear arsenal. Apparently, the Uran project, which was the name for Germany's nuclear tech research, had not, in fact, harnessed nuclear. They'd stockpiled hundreds of bombs, though, the largest being the SC-2500s. Big fuckers. Looked like there was a few dozen of them down here. Then there were the various PCs and SBs, all measures of aerial bombs. But the scary thing about them was, they were all open. They'd been wired together and connected to what appeared to be some kind of kill switch. I was willing to guarantee they'd still detonate if triggered. What many don't know about the Germans' bombs were about 10% of them never exploded. Many, in fact, would land and be buried under the rubble from other explosions going off. Namely, in England during the Battle of Britain, the bombs could sit there, some duds, but others live, for decades, even being built on top of, and not go off. But then, the slightest vibration just might. I'd been given 2 assistants who I sent off to begin inspecting the arsenal, pre-defusing. I just wanted time in here to myself, so I walked through the aisles, inspecting all the firearms, bombs, and explosives that had never been used. I was eyeing the Mauser carabiners, the MP40s, the MG42s. It was all a pretty big letdown. These were all old weapons, and nothing I wouldn't find in a high school textbook. It was all interesting, but what a disappointment. I picked up one of the Mausers, pulled back the bolt and checked it. Loaded, ready to be fired. I put it back down on the pile of other rifles, but caused them to shift and fall. The whole pile tumbled behind the shelf, knocking a wall panel loose. Sullivan rushed over and found me putting the rifles back onto the shelf. I told him everything was fine and that I'd been clumsy. I went back to looking through the weapons shelves, but the wall panel stuck in my mind. There was something behind it. Sullivan and the assistants eventually called it a day, so we packed up and went to the dormitory. I unpacked and laid in bed for an hour. All I could think about was the wall panel. What was behind it? I had to know. I snuck out of the dorm and back to the weapons hall. I made my way through the aisles of 12-foot shelves and found the rifles. There was the wall panel. I pushed it inward and found a small ramp that led to a tunnel under the floor. Fuck it. I got out my flashlight and crawled into the tunnel. There was just enough room to stand up and led back towards the elevator, but under it, I followed the path all the way to the end and saw the last thing I was expecting. And that concludes part 1 of FESTUNG 212. We hope you enjoyed it and are ready for its frightening conclusion on Sunday night at 8 p.m. We'll see you all there with a nice warm bottle of red.